everyone! Thanks so much for joining this session on GitHub Codespaces. My name is Brigit Murtaugh, and I'm a program manager on the Visual Studio Code team at Microsoft. So, how I kind of like to kick off this session is asking you to think about what is your ultimate developer dream? When we think about starting on a new project or contributing to something for the very first time, you may be thinking about, okay, I have to go ahead and clone the source code to my local machine. Or I need to think about what dependencies and languages the repo requires, and I need to download them on my machine, or take some time to figure out what versions I need. And all of these are totally fair and typically what we need when starting something new. But with GitHub Codespaces, you no longer need to worry about that. With Codespaces, they're both inside of GitHub, and GitHub is inside of Codespaces. So let's go ahead and take a look at how Codespaces work and how you can be productive using them. So if I navigate over here, this is going to be an example of a project that I want to go ahead and start contributing to. So I can see that I have this app and it's called a group calling sample. And it's this really cool application where I can go ahead and have these calling sessions with my friends. And I can see here as I'm scrolling through the prereqs, similar to what I was describing at the beginning, I'm thinking about, okay, what do I need to go ahead and get started with this app? I can see that it has .NET Core 3.1, and that's going to be a pretty fundamental requirement of this app. It also uses other things like Node.js and Azure. And even taking a look at the code structure that's explained, it looks a little bit complex and intimidating. And normally I'd be thinking about, okay, how do I need to set up my local machine and my development environment? And how do I clone this and set up everything so I can really get started? And how long is that going to take too? But with Codespaces, we no longer need to worry about that. We can just go ahead and hop into a Codespace and pretty much immediately start being productive, running our app, and start contributing back to it. So there's a couple of different ways we can start up on a Codespace for a specific project. We can use the code drop-down menu and start up on a Codespace in the web for this project. We can also use desktop Visual Studio Code and go ahead and use the Codespaces extension. And we can also go to github.com/codespaces, and we can see all of the codespaces we already have across different repos and create new codespaces at this point. So I'll go ahead and create a new codespace from this page. So I'll go ahead and choose a repository, and I'm going to choose that communications app. Okay, here it is. And then I can choose some other information, like which branch I want to create it on. I'll just create it on the main branch. And now I can say create codespace. So when we start it up, we're going to see that it's building this container environment. And essentially you can think of codespaces as these developer boxes in the cloud. They're initially going to be built on what's known as the kitchen sink image. And kind of like the name would suggest, the kitchen sink is going to include a bunch of different languages and tool sets directly out of the box. And so they're going to include things that we think that a lot of different developers might need to run their apps and to develop and become productive, but they're not going to be quite fine-tuned for this specific project. But I should be able to start contributing back in some way. So we'll see what's included. I'll exit out of this notification for now. And we can also see here that, for instance, it is running this command called postcreate command. And a little bit, we'll take a little bit more of a look at what different commands mean in the world of containers, since that is involved a little bit with Codespaces. But essentially, it's just going ahead and setting up this kitchen sink image. So that way, it has all the dependencies we need. And now we can see that our theme even changed within our Codespace. And that's because it does take advantage of other VS Code features like setting sync. So it can sync in the environment and even the theme that we use locally. So that way we really get this smooth, familiar experience that we already know in our local VS Code to become productive in these developer boxes in the cloud. Okay, so we can see that our environment has been set up, and now Codespaces gives us this nice welcome message that tells us we are on that default kitchen sink image, and it includes different runtimes and tools to help us become productive. So let's go ahead and see the wide set of tools that it comes with. We could even see the full extent of them at this link, but let's just see a couple of them. So for instance, do we have Python? Yes, we do. And then I don't see Java on this list, but let's see, do we have Java? Cool, we have Java installed as well. So it's that easy to go ahead and get this developer box where I didn't need to install anything. And I already have so many different languages that I might need to go ahead and start running or contributing back to different projects. So one of the first things that I want to do is just go ahead and try running this app. So what I would want to do is go ahead and navigate over to the run and debug view-let like I would in typical desktop VS Code. But I can see here that I don't really have a run environment or a debug environment configured yet. So I could maybe try creating a launch.json, or if I click on this, I could see the different options here, but I want to take a step back and think a little bit more about what is the proper next step here. So when I take a look at the files here and I think about how I want to configure my code space next, I had mentioned that we're on this kitchen sink, which does include different languages and tool sets out of the box. So for instance, I know I needed .NET. We have .NET version 5, which is great. But I believe in the README it said that .NET Core 3.1 is really the prereq here. And I think that I don't really need all of these extra tool sets. Like I don't really need Python or Java to make this application work. So that's where the next part of using Codespaces comes into play, which is known as development containers, or dev containers. So dev containers are going to allow us to further customize and fine-tune our Codespaces environments to really make them applicable to our specific apps and use cases. And dev containers are going to ensure that anyone else who goes ahead and works in this environment is going to have the same exact development experience when they work on it. So that way it doesn't just involve us specifically setting up certain tools in this terminal or in certain files, and then leaving it so that our other colleagues have to do the same when they set it up. We're going to ensure that anybody who works on this repo is going to be able just to hop in and have the same environment no matter what. So in the lower left here where it says Codespaces, I can click on that. And I'm going to click on this option that says Add Development Container Configuration Files. So we can see here that it already seems pretty intelligent because it's detected, hey, like maybe you're working with Node.js and maybe you're working with C#, and there's even a variety of other options. And I could say show all definitions and even get some more options. But C# sounds pretty good for me for creating a customized environment. And I can choose a specific version of .NET. I'll choose 3.1 because I believe that's what I saw in the README. And then I can even customize it further. So I remember that I do need Node.js in my customized environment, and I don't think I need the Azure CLI, but if I wanted to, I could go ahead and add it later. So I'll say okay. And the Codespace has already picked up that we've changed our backing environment or container in some way. So it tells us, hey, we've noticed a change to your dev container configuration. You should go ahead and rebuild the container to apply those changes. I will rebuild it to apply the changes, but not quite yet before inspecting the files. So I'm going to hold off for now. So we can see here that we've now added this .dev container folder. Let's explore the files inside. So if you're familiar with Docker-based development at all, a Docker file may sound familiar to you. And inside, we can see that it's first pulling from, and it's going to pull from an image. And now an image is essentially just going to define our environment. And it's pulling an image from the Microsoft Container Registry, or MCR. And a registry is going to be a collection of images, or a collection of different environments that we can choose from. And then we can see that we can go ahead and install Node.js, and we can even choose to install the Azure CLI. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this one for now. All right, so now that we have the Docker file inspected, let's take a look at this dev-container.json file. So even if you're familiar with Docker files, the dev-container.json may still seem new to you. And so the dev-container.json is essentially going to tell Codespaces or any sort of VS Code environment how to spin up and connect to a dev container. And so it's going to have various build properties and settings within it. So we can choose a name for our container, some different versions and properties, like for instance, did we want to install Node? Did we want to install the Azure CLI? We can specifically set certain settings that would be the same as putting them in settings.json. So that way, whenever we connect to this dev container, they're already going to be set for us. We can also have default extensions installed. So when working on this app, we're really going to need the C# extension. So we can have it that whenever anyone connects to this dev container, they're going to have the C# extension installed for them, which seems super useful. We can also go ahead and add even more extensions into this array here. So one extension that our team develops and really likes using is known as the GitHub pull requests and issues extension. And we have both a stable and a nightly version, depending if you want the latest fixes or to use it in VS Code Insiders. So what I can do is right-click and say add to dev container JSON, and then I went ahead and added the ID directly to this array. So now anytime that we connect to this dev container, we're going to automatically have these two extensions added to our environment. And then we have some additional properties, like we can choose specific numbers for ports to be forwarded for services or parts of our app running. And we even have this cool property known as post-create command. And I'm actually going to uncomment it and modify it because this is really helpful because it allows us to automatically run commands once the container is created. So for instance here, I could go ahead and modify this a little bit to make sure that our .NET project is properly set up and restored whenever we launch this environment. So I'm going to go ahead and modify it here. There we go. All right. So now that we've gone ahead and inspected our dev container environment here, what we can do is rebuild our code space. And now rebuilding it is going to rebuild the backend container, and that's going to make sure these changes take effect. And we're specifically going to have the environment that's designated within this folder here. And so we're not going to be on the kitchen sink anymore. So we won't have just this plethora of software and languages and tools installed, but we're just going to have the ones we need, and we're going to have the right version. So for instance, we wanted .NET Core version 3.1. And so now we're going to have that because we set that up in our dev container rather than .NET version 5. So let's go ahead and do it. I can click on the lower left here, and I can say rebuild container. So now it's going to recreate the code space. And let's go for it. Okay, so we can see that our code space has reloaded, and now the terminal tells us that we're on a custom image defined in our dev container JSON. Okay, and now we can see the C# extension. We need a couple of more assets. I'm going to say yes to make sure we can fully build and run our app. Okay, so I think we should be good to go for running our app. Let's go over to the run and debug viewlet. Nice. So now we can see we have this drop down. We can see that we actually have a configuration to run our app. Let's give it a shot. Say open. Codespaces takes care of port forwarding for us. So that way, whenever we have a service running within our app, we don't have to worry about configuring that or finding out the right URL. It's going to automatically be generated correctly through Codespaces. And here we go. Our application ran, and it's just like how we thought it looked like in the picture. So we can see we have our group calling app. Close out of that for now. And we can see also, if we go over here, we can see the ports that were forwarded, so front end and back end ports. And we can see Codespaces took care of all of it for us. I'll stop my app for now. Great. Okay, so now that we have this dev container environment set up, we want to make sure that we're going to be able to use it anytime we go into this application and anytime that any of our colleagues or just anyone else visiting the repo is able to get into it too. So that way they can quickly get started being productive on this repo. So let's go ahead and contribute it back to the repo. So I'll go over to the source control viewlet, and we can see that any changes that we make to our code are automatically picked up. So let's go ahead and add a commit message. So I'll say add configuration. I can stage my changes and just go ahead and commit them. Very easy. In the status bar, I'll go ahead and push, and I could have chosen to push them to a different branch, but I feel pretty confident about these changes, and I also want to make sure that anyone visiting gets them directly on main, so I'm going to push them directly to main. And it was that easy. So we could see how quick it is to commit directly back to our repo without ever having to leave our editor too. So now I'll just verify those changes did take effect. So I'll say go to repository. You can see add configuration. So those files showed up, and I never had to leave my development environment in order to contribute back to the repository. No cloning code locally necessary or anything like that. And so now we've seen how quick and easy it is to use Codespaces to make changes, to create these customized dev environments, to work with our code directly in the browser, and commit changes back to our repository without ever having to leave our editor. But there may be times in which we don't necessarily want to work in the browser, or even beyond that, we don't want to work specifically on a cloud compute. Maybe we need to work locally, or we just prefer to work locally. So we actually have a really cool alternative that we can use this same dev container setup. So we're still going to have the same customized environment, and we can contribute just as easily back to our repository, but we don't need back-end cloud compute. And that experience is known as VS Code remote containers. So let's see how that works. I'm going to open up VS Code in the desktop, and I'm going to go over to the extensions view-lit. And when I search it up here, I can search up remote containers. And by the extension name here, I can see that it allowed me to open any folder or repo inside a Docker container. So the only prereq for remote containers is that I have Docker installed and running on my local machine. All the backend compute and everything is going to be coming from my own machine. So let's see how we can contribute back to that same exact environment and run this same app through remote containers on my local machine. So now in VS Code locally, we can very similarly see we have this remote indicator in the lower left, which allows us to again interact with remote commands, similarly like we were doing in Codespaces. When I click on it, I can see that it is essentially our portal into interacting with remote extensions, because in VS Code Desktop, we have a variety of remote extensions, like for working with the Windows subsystem for Linux or WSL, or through connecting to different VMs or desktop machines through remote SSH. And we also have a Codespaces extension, so you can work with your Codespaces, but in desktop VS Code rather than through a web editor. So with remote containers, I have a variety of commands here. So I can see I have ones, for instance, if I already have source code cloned locally to my machine, I could reopen it in a container. I can attach to running containers, or I could do this thing known as clone repo in container volume. So that's actually the one that I want. And if I click on it, I can see that it'll allow me to clone any repo from GitHub into a container volume. And now a volume is essentially just an efficient storage mechanism that Docker will take care of all of the files and manage them effectively for me. So what I can do is let me go back to the browser, and I will find the URL for my repo and just copy it here. And I can paste it in. Now we can see that VS Code has reloaded, and it's going to start up this environment in my desktop. And now we can see that the files have shown up from GitHub. And in the lower left, rather than saying Codespaces, now it reads dev container. And this name, C#.net, came from the dev container JSON, because that's the name that we designated in that name property in dev container JSON. It's doing some final setup and downloads of necessary properties and software, and now it's finished. So I can go ahead and close out that terminal. It's just setting things up. So now I'm specifically in this same environment that was set up in Codespaces, but it's set up on my local machine in this local dev container. So if I wanted to verify that I have the right tool sets, let's make sure I have .NET. Cool, so this is the version of .NET that I set up for my dev container. And if I open up a local terminal, do I even have .NET installed on my regular local machine? Looks like I don't. So we can see that dev containers provide us this really cool way to have these separate environments on our local machine without having to have any sort of cloud-based or other sort of backend compute. So within here, again, I'll have full access to my files. I can contribute back to them. I could run my application. And since we made sure that we installed that GitHub issues and pull requests extension, what we could go ahead and do is see what it actually looks like. Okay, so what I can do is I'll make a change to the README. So I'll say update README. And over here, instead of committing directly back to main, what I want to do is create a new branch. So I'll call this update README branch. I'll publish this so that way it's actually available on GitHub, and allows me to either push it to my origin or to my upstream. So I'll push it to my origin. And then the pull request extension already prompts me if I'd like to create a PR, but not quite yet. I need to commit this change first. So I'll say update readme as the message. I can stage and commit. And then I need to just go ahead and push this change to my branch. Now that I've pushed the change, I can go ahead and create a new PR. So I'll create the pull request. And we can see that it prompts me to choose where to merge my changes from. So I can merge them from the current branch that I'm working on and where to merge the changes into. So I can merge them either into the upstream or the current repo that I'm working on. So I'll just merge them into the current repo that I'm working on. And I want to merge them into the main branch. I can choose a title for the PR. So I'll say update readme and even a description. It fills out some scaffold some text for me. So I'd say I'd like to update the readme. I could even create it as a draft. I'll say create. And it went ahead and created a PR directly within my editor. I didn't even have to leave. And again, this extension works both locally in VS Code, in remote containers, within Codespaces, so you can use it within any type of developer flow that you're working on. If I click on this, it'll bring me to the pull request directly within the browser. I can go ahead and add other features and labels that I would typically use, like reviewers and assignees and milestones. And I can merge the PR directly here. I can also go ahead and open up a diff view and do things like add comments. So I like this change. And I could start a whole review or just add a singular comment. So let's go ahead and merge the PR. And for some final cleanup, I'll go ahead and delete the branches that I just created. So very smooth and a great inner loop workflow for doing your source control flows directly within VS Code without ever having to leave your editor. So thank you so much for joining me for this session on Codespaces and dev containers and the remote containers extension in Visual Studio Code. I wanted to provide you some final resources where you can learn more and you can connect with our team further if you have any questions or feedback. So one really great resource is the Codespaces discussion board. So if you go here and you can provide some feedback to the Codespaces team, or you can ask any questions so as you try out Codespaces, or as you're anticipating trying it out, you can post any discussions here on the feedback board. You can also see what other folks are talking about and see if any questions or feedback you may have is already being discussed. So a great way to connect with the team there. Another good resource is this VS Code-dev-containers repo. And so these are going to be the definitions that are used within both Codespaces and in the remote containers extension. So when we did that add development container configuration files, that's a command that's both available within Codespaces and available within remote containers. Because like we saw, the same dev containers are compatible across both environments. So the definitions can be found within this repo. So in here, we can say containers, and then we can see all of the different container definitions that are here, and we can learn even more about them. So for instance, if we wanted to learn more about let's say .NET and SQL definition, we could learn here who are the contributors to the definition and more about the definition type and how to use it and all those kinds of things. And we can see that there are even issues and pull requests here. So if you'd like to go ahead and try contributing back to a definition or contribute your own definition completely, you can totally do that here. Another great resource that we have is this beginner's video series to dev containers. So it can really give you the fundamentals of working with dev containers and what are the different parts and how to create your own and customize them and things like that. So it's an 8-part video series, and myself, one of my colleagues, walks you through all the different parts. And so it's a useful series for both Codespaces and the remote containers extension. And then another resource, pivoting a little bit more towards the Visual Studio Code and remote containers side of things, is that we do have VS Code docs where you can learn all about remote development, including the remote containers extension and tutorials, and some more dev containers tips and tricks. And those dev containers tips and tricks will be applicable to Codespaces as well. And then finally, as you try out remote containers specifically, so pivoting again specifically to the remote containers experience in VS Code, you can provide us any sort of issues, questions, feedbacks, bug reports, anything like that within this VS Code remote release repo. And that is available on GitHub. You can also see any sort of feature work that we're planning, anything like that coming up in the open in our iteration plans that we have in issues available on the repo. And there are also great Codespaces specific docs as well, available on docs.github.com, where you can learn all about the specifics of Codespaces, working with them, creating them, and go through tutorials, helpful videos, and helpful quick starts. I've also gone ahead and included that same set of links and resources on this slide here, so you can reference them later, along with my full name and my Twitter handle, so you can go ahead and connect with me or let me know if you have any sort of questions or feedback as you try out these experiences. Thank you again so much for joining the session, and as always, happy coding.
Hey, it's Joe Eames with ng-conf. If you like that video, be sure to click subscribe either here or here, somewhere over here. And if you're looking for something more, here's another video for you to watch here or there or somewhere.